Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Physician's Mind podcast, the show designed to engage the curious mind and help optimize your journey of lifelong learning and self-improvement in medicine and beyond. I'm your host, Curtis Wilkerson. I'm an incoming medical student, and today I'm honored to be joined by Dr. Ian Storch. Dr. Storch is a private practice gastroenterologist based in New York. He trained at the University of Miami Gastroenterology and Hepatology program at the world-renowned Schiff Liver Institute. He also holds a faculty teaching position at NYITCOM and the Zucker School of Medicine at Hofstra Northwell. On top of this, he's the founder of the Do or Do Not podcast. The show is designed to engage in interviews with osteopathic physicians on how their life trials and tribulations got them to where they are. It's geared towards osteopathic students, but also for all healthcare students, pre-med students, and practicing physicians, as well as anyone else interested in healthcare. So Dr. Storch, thanks for joining me today. How are you?
I'm doing great, Curtis. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So let's just go straight into it here. We'll start from the beginning for you. Where did you go to med school? What was your medical school experience like? And why did you choose to be an osteopathic physician? What led you down that path?
Yeah, so I never thought I wanted to go to med school. So I'm not one of these people who woke up at like 3 years old with a Fisher-Price kit. You hear this story all the time, and we're taking people's blood pressures and stuff. I always wanted to be an English teacher. Yeah, I love literature. I thought I'd be a professor, and I went to college with that intention. It didn't really thrill my parents that much, but that's what I wanted to do. And I think I've carried that a bit. I still love literature and reading things outside of medicine, but when I was in college, I had a roommate who was that guy who always wanted to be a doctor, and he was like Joe EMT with the light on the top of his car. He had an oxygen tank in the back of his car, which I don't even know if you're allowed to do that. If you have a car accident, it might blow up or something. But he had an oxygen tank in the back, and when when I was a sophomore and we started living together, we were driving to get some food, and we saw this really bad car accident. And he was able to get out and help this woman. He dragged me along. I know you're an EMT, Curtis, so you appreciate this part of the story. He was like, Storch, you have to help me. Ultimately, I did the best I could, but when the ambulance came, I went off on the side of the road and got really sick. So not my best moment. But really, at the end of it, I realized that if I was by myself, I wouldn't have been able to do anything to help the woman. And as an EMT, Curtis, I'm sure you can attest to this. It's an amazing thing to have those skills and be able to help someone in need. So I signed up for an EMT class, and I loved it. And then I rode for an ambulance company. I was in Binghamton, New York, so upstate New York. I rode for an ambulance company for a year, and I loved that also. And I said, you know what, maybe I'm going to be a paramedic. That would be cool. And ultimately, through a series of events, I decided, maybe I could do a little more if I was a doctor. And I started thinking about med school. And in my third year, I'm sorry, Gary and I did not live together, although we stayed close friends. And I had another roommate who was pre-med. He was a year ahead of me. His name is James Dool. He ended up going to University of Rochester for medical school, and he's now an anesthesiologist. But he was the most organized person you could ever meet. He had a file cabinet with like all of his applications, and minute by minute what he did for his application. He said, I am going to bequeath this file cabinet to you, Storch, and this is going to help you get into med school. So I started going through his file cabinet, and I came across a book. And whenever I tell this story, I always explain. I know you guys don't have books anymore, but it's like a bound bunch of pages of paper, right? A book, right? So there was no internet, so I had this book. It was the Baron's Guide to Medical and Dental Schools, and it had about 100 pages of med schools. It had a few pages, maybe 20 pages of dental schools, and I read the whole book, and it was the first part was highlighted by James Dool. Second part obviously wasn't going to be a dentist, and the last page had 14 DO schools listed and a brief description of what osteopathic medicine was. And remember, I never wanted to be a doctor. I didn't have doctors in my family. I had no idea. I just knew I wanted to do as much as I could, and a physician sounded like a cool job. And I said, this osteopathic stuff sounds really cool. I just really thought it sounded amazing. So I went back to the library. I took out a stack of books that they had on osteopathic medicine. I read them cover to cover. There was, books by A.T. Still. There was Norman Gebet's The DOs, which I think everybody should read. Anybody interested in osteopathic medicine should read. And there was some manipulation books. I was like, this is great. And I wrestled at that time. I was on the wrestling team in college, and when I went home, I needed a physical. So in the middle of all this, I went to go get my physical. I went to my primary care doc with my Barron's book. I showed it to him. I said, "You ever hear of this DO stuff? This sounds pretty cool." And his name was Stuart Horowitz, and Dr. Horowitz said, "I am a DO, Storch. I went to Des Moines." And I was like, "That's amazing. How come I never knew you were a DO?" And he's like, "I'm just like a regular." He was a family practice doc. He said, "I'm just like a regular family practice doc, and I used to have DO on my code and my door." And a couple of years into practice, I wasn't getting any work done. I was just explaining this all day, so I ended up taking it off. But he said, he loved his education, and he highly recommended. He thought, if you want to do this, I love it. I think it's great. So I applied to osteopathic school, and the rest is history.
All right. So started from the EMT interest. Yeah, we don't know what books are these days, but you had a book that kind of showed you the way a little bit, and here you are. So osteopathic medicine now. You are the host of the Do or Do Not podcast. So obviously osteopathy and osteopathic medicine is near and dear to you. So can you share with us a little bit about what osteopathic medicine means to you?
Yeah, so again, I think I skipped part of your question. So I'm gonna go. I never answer. If you listen to other interviews, I feel like I never answer anybody's question. I apologize for that. But I was looking at DO schools, and again, going back to my story, and then I'm gonna go into your next question. Hopefully I will answer that one. But I was looking at DO schools. I said, you know what, go big or go home. So if I was going to osteopathic school, I applied to all the schools. Again, there were 14 at the time. It's much different now. And I decided, if I'm going, I want to go to the Founders School. I want to go to Kirksville. So I was going to go to A.T. Still in Kirksville, Missouri. I interviewed there. I loved it. For better or worse, I had a girlfriend who is not currently my wife, who I kind of convinced me that if we were going to stay together, I would have to come back to New York, and not necessarily the best decision of my life, although she was a lovely woman. I did come back to New York, and I made my decision to go to NYTCOM, which is where I went to medical school. And med school's hard. I think we probably broke up like 6 months into med school. So so that wasn't, again, the best way to make a decision, but NYTCOM was great. I really enjoyed my time there. They had great didactics for the first 2 years. We did rotations for the second 2 years. And ultimately, one of the places that we rotated was North Shore University Hospital, which is here on Long Island. I had a great experience there. And I ended up meeting a gastroenterologist, which who just was an awesome person, an awesome doctor. I just decided I wanted to be like him. So we'll talk about GI, I'm sure, later. But he mentored me, and I loved it. I ended up doing my residency at North Shore. I did my fellowship at University of Miami. Again, we can come back to that later. And then I came back to New York and set up a private practice here in New York. But after about 15 years, I was sitting with my wife, and I always want to do more. I'm always thinking about, what am I missing in my life? What else should I be doing? I'm very active. I like to keep my hands on a lot of things. And I decided that I wasn't doing anything osteopathic. So I did all of this medical training, and my practice is an osteopathic, but that's where I came from, and that's where I started. And those are my people, and those are the people who allowed me, my family, that allowed me to get to where I am today. So what did I want to do that was osteopathic? And at the time, there was a podcast that I loved, and this is early 2020, called "How I Built This" by with Guy Raz. It's an NPR podcast, and they interview entrepreneurs to see how they got to where they are. And I decided that, in thinking about osteopathic medicine, if I was a pre-medical student again and looking at schools or thinking about schools, and I didn't have Stu Horowitz and I didn't have the Barron's book, what would make me want to go to osteopathic school, or why would I want to go to osteopathic school? And I decided that if I could introduce a pre-medical student to my five best friends that are DOs, and you talk to them each for a half hour, you would want to be like them, one of them. They're all awesome. And again, not to take anything away from MDs, I have plenty of MD friends that are awesome. But if you talk to my buddies, you'd want to go to DO school too. And then I thought, how does a pre-medical student talk to these people? And I thought of Guy Raz, and I thought, wouldn't it be great if we had a podcast where people could just access conversations with great osteopathic physicians? Again, I don't want to sell anything to anybody. We decided, I decided we're not going to take any money for this. It's just going to be bootstrapping, and we're just going to interview great DOs so that people could learn about who we are and what we do. And that's kind of the beginning of the Do or Do Not podcast. And we're now on year 5. We've recorded about 170 episodes, and I don't see any end in sight.
Nice. That's very awesome. Yeah, great way for people to learn about the profession, to learn about the stories of different physicians and students and other professionals. It is great what you've done with that podcast. Now, on the topic of gastroenterology, right? You started medical school. You mentioned you had a mentor or maybe a role model that kind of set a good example. You thought he was pretty cool. What led you to going into gastroenterology?
Yeah, so it's a short story, which is when I did my first rotation. It's kind of like we have terms for these things like imposter syndrome now, which is kind of cool. But back then we just like called it like crying like a baby. So, yeah, we didn't have these great terms that make you feel better. But, I did my first medicine rotation at North Shore at the hospital I ended up doing my residency at. And it was, there were a couple of spots for DO students from MIT, but most of the students at the time were from Cornell.
Mm.
So when I got there, they had started a few weeks before me, and I was assigned a resident, and she was mean. She was like really mean. Like, again, there's no bullying now, all this stuff. I don't think you really do, but she was like a bully. And she asked me to sit down and write, all the labs in the chart. So a CBC has like 20 labs, and I've been practicing for like 20 years, and most people don't know what half the things on a CBC are. They're just not clinically relevant. We look at only a few of the numbers. And you write it in a very specific format. Nobody taught me that. So I sat down and I was writing a list of these 20 labs in a CBC. She walked over and she said, "What the heck are you doing? Like, this is ridiculous. Like, how are you writing this like this? Did you even go to medical school?" Yeah. And I was like, again, imposter syndrome, or it was really what it was. But I was like, maybe I shouldn't have gone to medical school. I really started doubting myself, and I remember being sad. And a gastroenterologist, again, this doctor named Ira Schmelkin, you can't make that name up, came up to me and he said, "Are you following this patient?" And I said, "Honestly, I don't even know what following a patient is. I'm ready to drop out of medical school." And he was so nice. And he was like, "Look, why don't we look at the chart together, and then we can go to the bedside and we can see the patient together and we can talk about what we're going to do." And I went with him, and he was so kind to me. And again, I formed a bond with him, and that was kind of it. The rest of it, I love being an internist. I love internal medicine. I love gastroenterology. I love doing procedures. Like, all these things are awesome, but it's kind of an after effect. And in reality, it all stems from Irish Schmelkin being mean to me when this resident made me feel like I should drop out of medical school. And I think a lot of people's stories like that too. Like, people say all kinds of nutty things about why they go into specialties. But, again, the whole idea of the Do or Do Not podcast, I think if you listen to a lot of stories, the themes repeat.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like I'm reading this book. It's called The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and it kind of
Love
has
the
the
book.
idea.
Joseph Campbell. Yeah, I love Joseph Campbell.
I'm so glad you know that because that's going to make everything so
Love.
much simpler. It's like
Yeah,
that
love.
Ira Schmelzen. What was the name? That was
Schmelkin.
the
Schmelkin. Yeah, Schmelkin.
Ira Schmelken. What that was the nice person.
He was the nice doctor. He was the Yoda. He was the mentor. He was the right. I mean, the threshold guardian was the evil resident who wasn't allowing me to go on in my career. Right.
Yes, and Ira was that supernatural aid that was there to offer you the way, open the
Absolutely.
door. That's
And
awesome.
again, Curtis, I already told you I was an English major in college. So if you think you're going to throw out Joseph Campbell and throw me for a loop, you got another thing coming.
I should have known. I should have
Yeah.
known. See, but that's great. So it was really that, and I think it's true. It's that simple sometimes. Like really, it takes like that one moment in life, and someone's just like, okay, you know what? This is just what's going to happen now, and then it happens. Like Chris Fulmer, the interview that we've talked about. He's just kind of maybe he had a few things that went on, but he ended up just deciding, okay, yeah, I'm going to commit to plastic surgery. Now here he is in plastic surgery.
Right. But again, I think the piece that's so important in Chris's story, and the theme, and again, it gets back to I don't know if your listeners know Joseph Campbell, but Hero with a Thousand Faces is a very famous man who studied mythology and psychology and kind of put them both together and basically found commonality among stories, whether they be myth or religion, in every culture and tied it all together. I think that the plastic surgeon that you're referring to, he went to osteopathic school. He found some interest in plastic surgery. His friend that he had met, who was actually ended up being an emergency room physician's father, was a plastic surgeon. And that plastic surgeon was, again, that supernatural being or that mentor or whatever term you want to use that really set him on his path. And if he hadn't met that person from his osteopathic school, he may not be where he is today.
Absolutely. And please forgive me. I was not trying to catch you on your breadth of literature. I should have assumed that you knew that book already. But my next question now, Dr. Storch, what does your practice look like today? You've made it through the crucible of residency, medical school, and follow-on training. What does your practice look like today? What are your typical cases? What do you do day to day?
Yeah, so I'm in private practice. I always say if I got reincarnated, I need 1,000 faces, like I need 1,000 lives. Like there's so many things that I would love to do. I loved academic gastroenterology. I seriously thought about being a teaching attending, but ultimately I thought it would be fun to like have a little business sense, to run a business, to run a practice. Some people hate it. There's so many doctors that go work for a hospital, which is fine because they don't want to deal with human resources, hiring, payroll. I have a very small mom and pop. I'm in solo practice. I run the business of my practice. My day usually starts at my alarm goes off. And I always tell people, don't be me. So, like, some people want me to be their mentor. I'm happy to do that. But, like, my first piece of advice is, like, just being me is probably not a great idea. My alarm clock goes off at usually 4 o'clock in the morning. Um, I get out of bed. I brush my hair. That takes a little time and shower, and
I can
then
tell.
yeah, exactly. And then I go to the hospital. I round. I usually have a small number of patients. My patients are admitted to the local hospital. I come back to the office. I have a endoscopy suite in my office. We can have that in New York. So I have a certified suite in my office. We do endoscopies and colonoscopies. That usually goes from about 7 a.m. to 1 o'clock, let's say, in the afternoon. And there's an anesthesiologist. We have staff. My staff is amazing. Again, we do screening colonoscopies, people with reflux disease, a million reasons why people might need those procedures. And then in the afternoon or on days that I'm not scoping, I see patients in my office to talk to them about their GI complaints and figure out what we can do to make them feel better.
And at what time of the day are you off work? Or is
Yes.
that even a time for you?
Yeah, I'm never off work, but yeah, I am. I usually, what time do I walk in the door? It varies by day, but I would say I usually, if consults come in or there are emergencies, I may go back to the hospital after. It doesn't happen every day. I do round on the weekend, but that usually takes a few hours, and then I do paperwork, and some payroll, office type of things on the weekend. Doesn't take a lot of time. But I usually get home between 7 or 8 o'clock to have dinner with my family.
And what's it like living in New York? Is it busy? Is it metropolitan, big city life? What's it like?
Yes, I live in a suburb of New York City called Long Island. We call it Long Island. We like merge it into one word down here. But I grew up here. I like it here. I think ultimately it's all about like what's inside of you. So I don't think it's where you are, it's who you are that makes you happy. People always ask, why did I leave Miami, Florida, yeah, that's a good question, right? I love Miami. I was offered a lot of jobs there. My mother-in-law is here. The saying, happy wife, happy life. I'm sure you've heard that one. So, ultimately, yeah, it's fine. My family's here. I'm happy to have my family. We're very close with my wife's family. My mother-in-law, my brother-in-law is a DO who I went to med school with. He introduced me to my wife. So my brother and sister-in-law live not far from us. And yeah, it's busy. There's a lot of people here. There's a lot of people with tummy problems, so it keeps us busy. It's good.
And since the girlfriend that you had when you started medical school isn't your wife, how did you meet your current wife?
Yeah, so my one of my good friends. So there was a doctor named Adam Kadoff who I became friends with the last rotation at NYT one of the last. We did cardiology together. We ended up at North Shore doing residency together. He's a great doctor. I stayed for an extra teaching year. I taught for a year. He lived one floor above me with his wife, so I was friends with Adam and his wife Rachel. And as they were graduating and I was going into my chief year and I already had this spot in Miami, he said, listen, I think you would really like my sister-in-law. I'd love to introduce the two of you. And there were a couple of like, I had a girlfriend, she had a boyfriend, like it just like some timing issues. But ultimately, we went out on a date. I think she agreed to see Spider-Man, like which she would never do with me now. But we went and saw Spider-Man in the movies, and I just like was like, this is the person I'm going to spend the rest of my life with, and she agreed to go to Miami with me. So she was actually a dietitian at a local hospital, not the one that I was at. She worked as a dietitian while I did my GI fellowship. And then we had a couple of kids and who are great. One of them wants to go to medical school, which I think is great. And I work a lot, obviously, so she's home taking care of the house and the kids, and I take care of people with GI problems.
Nice. And so you have a couple kids, you said?
Yeah, so I have a son named Noah and a daughter named Charlie. And, it's interesting always when you talk to docs about their kids going to medical school, and some of them are like, medicine's terrible. It's not what it used to be. And you hear all these kind of things. But like, I love my job. I would never tell my kids what to do. But, they both talk about being doctors. If they went to med school, I would be thrilled. And I think that, I would hope that they would love it as much as I do. And if they went to osteopathic school, that would be great.
Yeah, and there you go. It's a message of hope to all those medical students right now that are single and swamped in coursework. There's someone out there for everyone.
Exactly. Exactly.
So, okay, both the kids are thinking about being doctors. How old are they?
So yeah, my son's 17 and my daughter's 14.
Okay, yeah. I mean, and I guess it varies from doctor to doctor. It kind of depends on their mentality, their outlook on life, what situation they're in, their experience with medicine as to whether or not they're going to want their kids to do the same thing. But I appreciate how you said about living in New York. It's like it's not about where you are, it's kind of about who you are. I really need to embrace that philosophy coming from Arizona and now living in Michigan, where it's currently 3 degrees outside,
Right.
maybe 4. I think the high was 6 today. So I'm like, okay, yep, there we go, Curtis. It's about who I am, not where I am.
Yeah, listen, Curtis, you're about to start medical school. It doesn't matter where you are. You can be locked in the library. So as long as the heat in the library works, you're fine.
It's perfect. It's perfect because here it's not like I'm missing out on any awesome like sunshine activity. It's like, yeah, nothing's going on anyway. Might as well be studying.
Absolutely. I did undergrad in Binghamton, which is really cold, and I did my GI fellowship in downtown Miami. And once in a while we'd go to University of Miami. The hospital is called Jackson Memorial, is the main campus of University of Miami. So that's where I was most of the time. But every once in a while we go to the main college campus, which is in Coral Gables. And at Coral Gables is beautiful. There's like a pool there. There's like men and women walking around with like tank tops and bikinis and all kinds of craziness. And I would always think like, there is no way I would have gotten into medical school if I was here. I was much better off in cold, freezing Binghamton in the library. So there's
Well,
something to be said.
it's true, and I think it's amazing coming from Arizona State University undergraduate. It is amazing that I made it into medical school with the abundant distractions that are available in Tempe, Arizona. So on that note, but now, given that I'm a incoming medical student, I like to kind of orient this show towards somewhat of people who are in a similar demographic to me, right? Incoming medical students, current med students, or maybe some residents, and of course, the rest of the medical community. But for you, Dr. Storch, I want to ask, right, what kind of advice would you have for an incoming medical student or perhaps a student that's early on in their journey that perhaps is osteopathic student, perhaps is an allopathic student, but what advice would you have generally for a medical student that wants to do well in medical school and beyond?
Yeah, so my advice is number one, for a pre-medical student, like if you really want to do it, figure out a way to do it. I mentor a lot of students through the podcast. Some people have an easy road getting into school. I think everybody has some hiccups and challenges. So, keep your chin up. And if you really think you want to be a doctor, you'll figure out a way to do it. For people in med school, or even for people in undergrad, sometimes I talk to young medical students and they tell me like that they know that they want to be something. They have some specialty. I want to be an orthopedist because I love sports medicine or what have you. I think you got to keep an open mind. I think always the best answer from people is when they say they don't know what they want to do. You're not supposed to know what you want to do. It's really impossible to know. Like, would I ever think in a million years I would be a gastroenterologist? No. And people ask me all the time, like, you're like playing with poop all day. Like, why'd you pick this? Like, could you pick something else? But I love GI. And again, it was because of Irish Schmelkin. So like, I mean, who would have known that I would have run into Irish Schmelkin and fallen in love with the specialty? So I think you have to keep your mind open. I think it's all about, if I had to give advice on how to be successful, no, as far as school goes, like when you're in the didactic years, just put in the time and work hard. Don't focus so much on the actual grades. Obviously, you got to pass your classes, but don't let yourself get beat up by the number. There's a lot of smart people in med school. Med school's hard, and then when it comes down to like how do you succeed, I think you always and I think this is sometimes what makes DOs, and MDs have the same thing, but DOs I think have this chip on their shoulder we always talk about, like we have something to prove. So I think you got to show up, you got to work hard, you have to like show other people that you're there to succeed, that you're there to learn, that you're there to because you're interested. And again, getting back to that plastic surgeon that you interviewed, when you really listen to his story, you could listen and be like, oh, this guy, like how easy this was, and he talks about some of his trials and tribulations, but he really, he was going on audition rotations, making phone calls, like really using every resource that he had, once. And again, I don't think everybody should be a plastic surgeon. I certainly wouldn't be for me. But, again, when you do decide what you want to do, you just put in 110%. And I think you can do anything you put your will to.
Absolutely. Great advice, Dr. Storch. I think it's amazing how, when you think about it, everything that's manifested into reality had its origins in the human mind, right? This is Napoleon Hill, Think and Grow Rich. I already know you've read this book.
Absolutely.
So it's really a manner of deciding what your vision is going to be, what your goal is for the future, and then developing such a strong emotional connection to that goal, that vision, that your original desire just becomes an obsession. And in medicine, I think that's a valuable idea because you start out so far behind from where you want to end up. And you have to maintain that vision. You have to maintain the reason why you want to get into it. And you just have to go and you have to commit and you have to make those phone calls. You have to go on the audition rotations. You have to do what it takes. And like you mentioned, the student that really wants to be a doctor is going to figure it out. They're going to find a way.
And, I think just getting back to finances, on our podcast, we had Jim Dolly on a few times, who's the white coat investor, who's just a great guy and a good resource. He talks a lot about, finances, intraspecialty versus interspecialty, and the fact that interspecialty is much greater. So, the point being that, if you look on a Medscape list, there may be certain specialties that make more money than other specialties. My advice to students is always don't make a decision based on that chart. Make a decision based on what you love, what you find that you want to do. And then if you decide that the average salary for XYZ specialty is this, again, the interspecialty variation is huge. And there are definitely ways in any specialty that you could gauge your practice and make more money. So if you love emergency medicine, you're an EMT and you think that's what you want to do, there are things that you could do within that practice, within your ER practice, to make more money if your goal is to make more money.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
if your goal is to do like 40 hours worth of shifts and go home and enjoy your family and make a very good living, that's also a good reason, a good way to do ER.
100%. And Jim Dolly, the white coat investor, I'd highly recommend his content to any of my listeners. He's a fantastic doctor, a fantastic podcast host, and a great businessman. Lots of valuable insights for anybody who wants to learn more about finances as it relates to medical school and beyond. Hopefully one day I can have a conversation with him. But on that note as well, with finances, with physicians and trying to make it work, right? I was going to mention with making the decision to go to medical school, it's like, if you're doing it for the status, for the prestige, for the money, that's just not going to work. And I'm sure you'd agree with this, Dr. Storch. It's like, if you really want to do something, then do it, like regardless of what the statistics say about the average salary, because with that, right, there's a lot of resources online now, especially in the physician world, where people are talking about ways to become financially free and to become wealthy as a physician. There's so many resources out there. In fact, there's a great podcast called Assets in Orthopedics, Dr. Kyle Stevenson. He recently had on Dr. Vikram Raya, who made the comment that these days as a doctor, you should consider being a doctorpreneur, right? Being a doctor, making your normal physician salary while doing something outside of medicine to generate some level of passive income. And yeah, this is optional. This is totally something like you said, if you want to work the 40-hour week and go home, you totally can do that. But if you want to become the rich doctor, there's plenty of options for you. So whatever specialty you end up in, you can become a real estate investor. Talk to Dr. Dolly about that one. You could do real estate. You could do so many things to make money. So just go into what you want to do, right?
I agree. Yeah, and I think you gotta, no matter what you do, you don't want to wake up every day and be miserable going to work. So, always advise, just again, no matter what you decide, and if you hate medicine, don't do it. The medicine's a lot of work. Medicine is definitely not the best and quickest way to make money. So, I think if that's your goal, then probably you shouldn't do medicine. But again, if you love medicine, I think there's no better career. You're helping people on a daily basis, and will always be able to, support your family.
Well said. Now, we have a few more minutes here. I want to ask you just a few final questions here.
Sure.
What is the most enjoyable part of being a gastroenterologist to you, Dr. Storch?
Ooh, that's a tough one. So I think the best part of being a gastroenterologist is when, and I don't know that there's a best. I don't know if I could answer that. I don't know if I could answer that. But I would say the best part of being a doctor, and again, it's just in my practice. What's the best part of my practice is when you do something for someone, and they show appreciation. I think like a lot of times, that's why doctors get burnt out and upset. And you understand all these things. Like you do all this stuff, and maybe you don't feel that people fully appreciate it. But once in a while, you'll get a card, or I'll get a card in the mail from a patient that I made a diagnosis on and really changed their life. And, they just write, Storch, I really appreciate you and thank you for everything that you've done for me this year. Like, that's the best gift that you can get. And those moments, or you get maybe a patient comes in and says, sometimes it's very subtle, says, look, do you know why I'm here, and maybe they're just here for a colonoscopy, or something simple. And they're like, Jen Smith. There is no real Jen Smith, obviously, no HIPAA violation. Yeah, but Jen Smith, said that you saved her life. And I was talking to her about, having a colonoscopy, and she said, there's no one that you should see other than Dr. Storch. And I think those are the best times, because they really just reaffirm that, again, going back to why you went into medicine, that you went to medicine to help people, and that you are helping people. And it just makes you feel warm and fuzzy inside, and it reaffirms why you spent all that time in the library, which you haven't done, Curtis, yet, but you can think about this interview when you're there crying. But that's why you spent all that time crying in the library. It was all worth it at the end, because you were able to help people.
Beautiful. What's the most challenging part of being a doctor?
Sometimes, I would say the flip, there's two sides to the coin. So one side of the coin is what I just told you. The other side of the coin, and I'll give you another answer to the question, but sometimes patients are challenging. Sometimes my staff will be like, again, no HIPAA violation. Jen Smith called, and like, she was really mean to us, and she yelled at us, and people are angry. And I always explain to them, like, people are sick. They're coming to see us because they have a problem. They're not feeling well, and sometimes they don't react in the best manner. So sometimes, interpersonal relationships, interpersonal discussions can be challenging. And again, it's not necessarily you did anything wrong, or the patient just doesn't feel well, and then sometimes you're not meeting that person at their best hour, and that's tough. And a follow-up question, or just to answer a question that you could ask, is, sometimes, and I was talking to a friend of mine about this yesterday, being a proceduralist, like, what's the best part of being a proceduralist? Being a proceduralist in medicine is cool, right? So, like, for me, I get to do colonoscopies and endoscopies. I told you half my day is doing procedures. A good part of my week is doing procedures, and that's fun. It's like technically fun. But the flip side is, sometimes people have complications. Thank God for me, it's not a common occurrence. But, if you do enough procedures, things are going to happen. Even if it's not your fault, things can happen. And, if you're a caring, loving physician, it just, takes a toll on you and is difficult. I have a friend, one of my best friends is a cardiologist, and he does interventions. And like, if you saw what this guy does, he does valves through. He's a DO, by the way, not to keep pushing the DO, but yep, shout out. But he puts in these great valves. He puts in stents. He takes care of people that are having heart attacks. But sometimes people, like, he tells me these stories, like, he saves their life. They rested on the table. He shocked them 3 times. They came back. Oh, woohoo, he saved their life. It sounds great, but like, all this stuff, like, it's stressful in the moment. And I'm, again, he's a caring guy, and I'm sure it, every time he, for me, or at least if I was the person in charge of that, I don't know if I could do that job, So I think even though procedures seem cool, sometimes there's an added level of stress, anxiety over them, and you got to really weigh out whether that's what you want to do. Which, again, I wouldn't give up being a gastroenterologist, but I wouldn't trade places with my bestie who's an interventionalist. I couldn't do his job.
And I should have asked you that question first so we could end on the positive note. But all this to say that it's great being a doctor, because you can take care of people and really improve their lives in a way that you wouldn't be able to do without your medical expertise.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, Dr. Storch, as we wrap things up, I want to ask you one final question here. I mentioned in the beginning that the mission of this show is to engage the curious mind to help optimize lifelong learning and self-improvement in medicine and beyond. Do you have any last words of advice or wisdom that you'd like to share in line with that mission?
Absolutely. So, that's an easy question. So, for any of you listening, specifically if you're pre-med, if you're in med school, if you're in osteopathic school, if you want to learn more about what a DO is, about what a DO does, about what's possible with an osteopathic degree. The DO or Do Not podcast interviews DOs again every 2 weeks. We have over 150 guests to date. We've interviewed people from family practitioners who take care of 3 generations of patients, rural doctors in small towns that take care of the whole town amazing, to neurosurgeons, and with Curtis's help, a plastic surgeon. So we run the full gambit. And I think the best way to learn about osteopathic medicine is to hear the stories of great DOs, and that's what we do. So if you're interested, do or do not podcast.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Awesome. Yeah, folks, DO or Do Not podcast. I'll make sure to include those links in the show notes here. We've been speaking with Dr. Ian Storch. Dr. Storch, thank you so much for joining the Physician's Mind podcast.
Thanks again, Curtis. Pleasure.